This show is brought to you by Safety FM.
What's up, peeps? Welcome back to Rebranding Safety. Today we're talking all about fire safety with a guy that we've spoke to before but had lately become somewhat a bit of a celebrity. Let's jump into the intro and I'll tell you some more about it.
The problem in safety isn't deviation, it's complexity.
Health and safety has gone mad.
Health and safety is trying to unpick having gone mad in the past.
There's no one solution and one problem. The problem is that we are looking for one solution.
Does the structure of the team allow them to flourish?
Feel safe enough to be uncomfortable.
The environment defines our behaviours.
People aren't the problem, they're the solution.
Rebranding Safety, crushing the stereotype. Brought to you by Risk Fluent.
What's up, peeps? Welcome back to Rebranding Safety. Rebranding Safety is the YouTube channel and podcast, not podcast. Podcast, doing exactly what it says on the tin. So if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and the bell and all those buttons that do magical algorithm thingamajigs. So this week we are talking all fire safety. We're talking all what's going on after Grenfell. Have we still not sorted that? That's basically what we're talking about. Our guest today was one of our early guests that we had on the podcast. If you remember, his name is Matt Hodges-Long, and we talked all about compliance and what that looks like for insurers and through this software and just staying on top of everything. And he runs a company that manages that process for you and makes it so much easier. But since Grenfell, he has been kind of passionately really getting deep into this behind the scenes and looking at what Dame Judith Hackett said and looking at the inquiry and really trying to provide solutions. So his company have come up with like the Building Safety Register and they're really just trying to make a difference in this space. And because of this, today's guest has been on LBC, the very, very popular debate radio show, I suppose you could call it, talking to the really big time people that there is there. So we touch on that a little bit as well. And majoritively we are talking about fire safety. We're talking about the fallout of Grenfell. We're talking about where we are now and the kind of mess that we're in and where we're pulling from kind of Matt's current experience and then my past experience from working in housing and healthcare and predominantly fire safety for like the last God knows how many years. I will caveat that to just say I really apologize for my audio. I tried to fix it as much as I could. I'm not really sure what happened. We did record this a long time ago, so I think it was before I moved over to the new system, and we were having a lot of problems with the old system just before we moved over. So I think it was just a bad day, so I apologise for that. Matt's audio is all right, so hopefully it's tolerable for the rest of you. Before we jump into the podcast, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to our sponsors. Our official Rebranding Safety sponsor is Paradigm Human Performance HSE subscription service. This is the perfect solution for those SME business owners, operations directors, whatever you call yourself. Maybe you're even a safety professional for those small, medium-sized enterprises. And sometimes you can feel like you're spinning so many plates and safety is just a bit of an unaffordable luxury, which is normally fine for a long time. But Paradigm truly believe that the cost of building a solid foundation of legal, regulatory and industry compliance and embedding that into everything that you do should really never be beyond the reach of a SME or the employer. And their global mission is to make workplaces safer, more respectful, healthier, and places where workers are recognised for their subject matter expertise and recognised for their contribution. Because worker safety has got to be part of your DNA, if your organization is going to thrive, Paradigm Human Performance have a way to make this reality through their HSE subscription service. So hopefully this is the right thing for you. I feel like it is. They start from just £99 a month. I'll put their website in the description, their phone numbers, their email address, everything you need to get hold of them. And if you're still not sure, you can go to their website and just sign up to their weekly webinar, which frankly is amazing. And you can try before you buy, so to speak. You can get a sense of the Paradigm team. You can see trees every now and then and just get a sense of what they're doing. And don't forget the paradigm are human performance, human and organizational performance experts. So this isn't your bog standard compliance system. This is compliance. This is basic foundational safety, contemporary safety with HOP, with safety innovation woven into it. That's just what you want, really, isn't it? It's you're skipping out all that bit in the middle where you have to unlearn what you've done for the last 10 years. So check them out, and I'm sure they'll be right for you. We wouldn't have aligned with them if we didn't think that they were right for at least some of our audience. So go check them out. And finally, just a message from my company, Project Mollitiam. Project Mollitiam is the professional development community. This is a community that we wanted to build. Me and Colin Nottage, who runs an amazing podcast called the Interest in Safety Podcast, we combined together, so long ago now, and we've been running about 3 months. We've got a massive stream of members coming in, and they're all absolutely loving it. You know, some members are telling us that this is the best thing after years and years of trying to get some support and some help to grow and become a better professional. This is the thing that they felt they were missing, and that's exactly what we were trying to do. It's a mix of weekly community calls where we help you develop and we solve problems together, combined with a monthly book club and a quarterly wagon wheel, which essentially is just like a mastermind event. We have a keynote, we have workshops from that keynote, and then we have one of our own members talking about their challenges through the form of another keynote, and then we do workshops to help that. We feed that member back some support and guidance based on our own experience, and then we finish off by setting some goals for the quarter. We've got so much more coming as well. We are growing quick and we're developing our offering. So go and check out www.projectmollitiam.com or drop me a message and I'll get you on a call completely free of charge so you can try it before you buy it. Without further ado, let's get into my conversation with the legendary Matt Hodges-Long. I mean, we spoke such a long time ago, and you've literally just kind of shot into the echelons, the upper echelons of society. And it'll be good to just kind of talk about a couple of things. It'd be good to kind of talk about, you know, where you've been and what you've been doing since we last spoke, and then it'd be really interesting just to kind of just get into the crux of all this stuff that's going on in the world of fire safety, cladding, Grenfell. Oh God, there's loads of stuff, isn't there? Fire consultation. I think that's finished now, is it? And then you've got the consultation safety bill, and it's all over the place. And
okay. Well, let's just talk about.
You're pretty much a celebrity now, Matt, aren't you? Going on LBC.
Well, I wouldn't say celebrity because it's always crushingly disappointing at how short the interview is. So I normally end up with pages and pages of notes. I mean, this is some of my preparation for my last LBC interview. Yeah. And then you end up with 30 seconds about something you didn't expect to talk about. So I mean, it's good fun doing live radio though. I mean, that's kind of jeopardy of not knowing what Nick Ferrari's going to say, because there's no briefing. You kind of know the broad outline, but they don't give you questions beforehand. You just get pitched straight into live radio to make an absolute tit of yourself if you're not careful. So,
it must have been scary. I've listened to LBC. I don't listen to it much anymore because it just makes me angry. But Nick Ferrari, and to be fair, the other one you had was Sheila Fogarty, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Mate, they're probably the two that I would actively avoid. Like, they're really scary people. Like, I'd have been crapping myself. What was that like when you were like waiting to be put through?
Well, you're lined up. So the interview I did with Sheila Fogarty was over the phone.
Mm-hmm.
So you're listening while you're on hold. You're listening to her speaking, and then all of a sudden they say putting you through now, and that's it. Sheila's talking about you, and you're introduced and you talk. So that was absolutely fine. Whereas the Nick one was I was pre-booked and it was over Skype.
Okay.
So the night before they were meant to be calling me. So Nick Ferrari has a night producer. I don't know whether I'm giving away secrets I shouldn't give away here, but they have a night producer. He has people working through the night preparing his show for the next morning because it's the flagship show.
Right. Yeah.
The breakfast show, and it got to about 10:30 the night before, and they hadn't called me to set up Skype. So typically it's sort of all last minute. So we left it until the morning, early the next morning. We got it all set up. And then I was due to go on air, and then he decided that he was going to push the segment later on in the hour.
Oh, really?
To the next hour. So then they called me and said, look, we're really sorry, are you available? So literally you have to block your diary out because you don't know when this is going to happen. And apparently Nick is legendary for changing the running order, as is his wont. But no, it's good fun. So I'm there talking to him over Skype on the wall of the studio, and then they video it. And yeah, it was good fun. It was, I think the more of them you do, the more relaxed you get about it in a way.
Yeah.
And I think I don't think I'd want to be on sort of as having to defend myself. I was invited to be there to talk about an expert subject, and I've been involved in the story, working with them behind the scenes to sort of build that story. So I was very much on their side, if you like.
Yeah.
But you never quite know whether there's a question that's going to come out of left field and you've got to answer it live. But it's all part of the jeopardy. I've done some BBC work recently, which was good up in Milton Keynes, and there's lots going on behind the scenes. So I think a lot of the media work I'm doing now, I'm not actually in front of the camera or on the microphone. It's sort of very much expert information behind the scenes, because I don't want to be out there all the time just gobbing off about things. I think a lot of the power of it is in working with these journalists on the stories, and then I think hopefully when there's a really big one I need to be overt about, then they'll say yes. So that's the way it's working at the moment.
Cool. Well, that's awesome.
We've still got time for you. Still got time for you, James, and Rebranding Safety.
That's it, mate. Yeah. When I messaged you, I thought, if he says no, I'm too busy, shit's going to hit the fan, because I'm going to say, hey, years ago we had you on before you spoke to Sheila Fogarty, and you were big time. Don't forget the grassroots.
No, I'll never forget you, and I think it's really important that people remember how they got there. So always remember the people that have been good to you. But no, I mean, I wouldn't. I think when I start actually earning money from doing media, then I'll stop talking to you. But at the moment, it's all it's all for free. I don't see that changing, because I've definitely got a face for radio. So
you're not going to send me an invoice after this, are you?
No. It's all good. It's a freebie.
So talk to me about how this stuff has come about, because it's all come around that one, not the one piece of work. Obviously, there's a hell of a lot going on, but that one issue that's all stemmed out of Grenfell. And talk to me like the work you've been doing there. Kind of take us through that journey since the last time we spoke to you, and how you've come now to be working with the BBC and so on and so forth. I suspect that's quite a long story, but yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think obviously we've been working for the last 5 or so years selling risk management software to anybody that wants to buy it at scale, and looking at different markets and working in education and healthcare and financial services, etc. But this was post-Grenfell was the first issue where there was proper engagement, if you like, in the subject, because let's face it, it's pretty boring. So it's not really a mass market kind of discussion topic, managing risk or compliance or whatever it is. It's very sort of behind the scenes. Whereas after Grenfell, this kind of spilled out into the sort of the consumer arena, where you've got thousands, if not millions, of leaseholders that are stuck in buildings that may or may not be safe, suffering from a lack of information from managing agents and freeholders, and having problems with insurers. And really there's just this massive need to pull everything into one place for everybody to understand what's going on. And quite what risk they're at. So that really sort of fitted well with what we did as a business anyway, but banging on the door of government trying to get them to listen wasn't working. So last June, so June before last, we set up the Building Safety Register as a brand.
Oh, excuse me, sorry.
So we set up the Building Safety Register as a brand, and almost went direct to consumer with it, and sort of started engaging in the conversation with residents about building safety. And that just got us on the radar of media, and people started asking us questions and saying, I'm writing this magazine article, could you just give us a quote on this? And the radio stuff, I'm trying to think how that came about. I think it was just referred in, and I think Rachel Venables from LBC called me and said, "Oh, it's Rachel here from LBC. I just want to ask you something quickly." And we've just ended up chatting to each other and sending WhatsApps and discussing stories and things like that. And now I look at it and there's all this media stuff going on, so stuff going on with Which and BBC and LBC and various news outlets and regional news. And it's just kind of happened really. But I mean, it's not as though the phone's ringing off the hook with, we need your comment on everything. You still have to work on it and things take time. And what I've learned from it is to get that sort of 3 minutes on the radio. And we did a story recently about fraud in EWS1, which is the external wall survey, which we might talk about. But that was probably 6 weeks worth of work that LBC and various other contributors, including me, put into trying to get the information together for that story. And it ends up being 3 minutes out of 24. Okay, they repeat the 3 minutes, but still it's a relatively short amount of content. So it's quite amazing actually how much time the news agencies will put into researching and developing a story. I'd never really considered, not being a media person, quite how much work goes on behind the scenes and how much of it doesn't get to air for legal reasons, or you can't triple, quadruple check the facts, so therefore it doesn't go to air. So it's been a real eye opener to see how that works. Being a humble software risk management weird person.
So talk to me. Tell us about the building safety register and what you've done with that then.
So really, that's pushing for a digital system of record or a single version of the truth for every building, for all of its fire and life safety information. And really, it's the precursor to Dame Judith Hackett's golden thread concept that came out of Grenfell. Hers is quite complex in nature, and it's looking at building information modeling and lots of data aspects around a building. And we sort of looked at that, dumbed it down and said, well, if we've got 13,000 buildings that already exist, how are we going to start building that for the legacy? So let's start pulling things together. Do you have a fire risk assessment? If you do, where is it? When did you last do the electrical inspection? Where's a copy of it? Where's the evacuation strategy for the building, et cetera, et cetera? And then working with companies and saying, you've got to do that hundreds of times within a portfolio. So whether it's a housing association or a private managing agent, whoever it is, start doing it, start gathering the information, start permissioning that to residents so they can see some of it, which ticks the Hackett resident engagement box. So there's lots of elements of the Hackett review, which is coming through into legislation through the Building Safety Bill, that are all ideas, but nobody's really got the technology to implement them yet. So we're sort of saying, well, come and talk to us. There's bits we need to build onto it, but that's really essentially what it is. It's sorting, it's the same as when we spoke last time. It's that evidential records management, and it's about consistency. It's about, I know you don't like the word, but about compliance. It's about doing the basics well. And our view sort of is that if that sort of rising tide floats all boats, if we can make all of these buildings a bit safer quickly, then everybody benefits from that improvement in building safety. So that's what we do. But it's how we sell our software to housing associations and managing agents. But it really helps the residents as well, because they now know that they can ask for information, and hopefully their provider will share it with them.
Yeah, but it's an interesting thing when I think engaging with residents is something that's lacking in that industry, in the housing sector, massively. I think people do it, but I wonder whether it's kind of like valuable engagement, if you know what I mean, and whether it's engaging across all the different diverse kind of tenures and groups of people that are in different types of properties and so on. You know as much as I do, like housing is an absolute just nightmare sometimes of how it's set up, and it's an absolute mess. But being kind of open and honest and providing fire risk assessments and stuff like that is to residents is I think really important, and I was quite pleased to see that in the Hackett report. But it does bring like just some real complications, and I speak from my own experience here. It's like
if you get a good fire risk assessment, if you get a bad one, this probably doesn't matter. But if you get a good one, there can be some really technical documentation. Like a good fire risk assessment could be really technical, and you're giving that to people that are not really technical. And it's I'm wondering how, I don't know whether you're engaging with like the end user, like the resident much, but or even from talking to your customers, like how are people kind of dealing with that? Like they're giving it to the resident, but like what's the feedback off the back of that? You know, what are residents feeling like? Do they understand it? Is it creating a mountain out of a molehill, or is it all good, or is it a mixed bag? Do you know what I mean?
It is mixed. I mean, I think there is a lot of worry that this is going to be another stick to beat us with from a landlord's perspective or a building manager's perspective. And then there's others at the other thing that's at the other end that say, look, we're not perfect, we're open. Yeah. We explain this to our residents. We publish these to them as a matter of course, and we explain, and we do have to manage expectations that putting that fire door keep shut sticker on a riser cupboard somewhere is not as high a priority as making sure our AOVs are operational, or our firefighting lift is maintained, or whatever it is. So there's different rankings to it. And I think generally what I would say is that most residents have far more capacity to understand these things than most landlords would probably choose to think. I mean, for example, the building safety bill consultation has finished, and we launched a database today where we've analysed the written consultations, and 62% of the written responses to that new piece of legislation came from leaseholders.
Wow.
And they're really well informed. I mean, generally, one of the things that has come out of this whole issue post Grenfell and cladding scandals, building safety scandals, crises, whatever you call it, is the level of technical competence of residents that live in flats and apartments is just, they could talk all day on approved document B and compartmentation and cavity barriers and different types of insulation and EPS and render systems and all sorts of things. It's just unbelievable that, because they've had to learn. And what's actually happening now is where landlords or government could have bullshitted people and blinded them with science, they can answer most of the questions themselves, or if they can't, they know the experts to go to say, I've been told this about my cladding. They'll go to one of the country's leading cladding experts that they've met on Twitter, and they'll send them a photo, and the expert will come back and say, no, that's wrong. So the whole sort of social media age has moved into cladding and building safety now, and you've got this super informed growing group of people that have got amazing press contacts. This story has run in the Sunday Times, I think, for the last 5 weeks on the trot. There's been half a page or a full page or 2 pages about this issue in the Sunday Times, week in, week out. BBC News at 10 last week, 6 o'clock news as well. Mainstream media attention. I think for anybody that's just thinking, keep our heads down, it will go away. No, it won't. There's more and more data coming through. There's more and more pressure. They're now seeing a lot of pressure mounting on the house building companies that have got sort of historical defect issues.
Yeah.
Although the statute of liabilities may have gone, the brand hasn't gone away. So there's brand damage being done. And I think this is just going to become a bigger and bigger issue until the industry and government work out how they're going to pay to fix the problem. Because it cannot be right that young families and young professionals and older professionals and retired people are being hit with 10, 20, 30, 50,000 pound bills to effectively make up for deficiencies in regulations and poor quality construction over years. Human opinion will not be on the side of those policymakers. And they're doing a bloody good job at keeping this in the press alongside COVID and Brexit and all the other big things that are going on. Sort of story number 3 is this whole sort of housing, building safety, cladding scandal issue, I would say.
Leaseholders, man, I just, from my experience, it's just shocking how they're treated. It's just shocking. And you kind of alluded to it there, but sending them bills for fire, what I would call essential fire safety repairs or requirements in a building, and saying you need to pay for this because you're a leaseholder. And I understand the behind the scenes of it. Like if you're a big company, you've got general needs property. So that's like rented stock. You've got rented stock property and the company pays for repairs on a leasehold building. That company would say, well, essentially that means the rented stock are subsidizing the leasehold. But and that part of the game, I don't really understand the kind of finance and legal side of things. But when I look at this from my point of view, I, like, you know what I'm like, Matt. I like to think, drill things down to the simplest form. Let's really try and make this simple. In that, well, let's take compartmentation as an example, because this was always the one that came up with me. Fire doors. So a leaseholder has a flat. Their front door will be a fire door, or it should be a fire door.
Yeah.
And you come along, or I come along. I'm a fire assessor. I come along and I say, right, that fire door's absolute dog shit. We need to get rid of it. Right, replace it. They will then back charge that, or they will not do it and issue the job to the leaseholder. So it depends on what kind of landlord you're dealing with. They'll either do it and then back charge it, or they'll say, right, that's your job, Matt, because you're the leaseholder. Now, as far as I'm concerned, fire door is one component of a building-wide system, a shared system in which we would call compartmentation.
Yeah.
So therefore, it is no different from any other shared system in water, electrics, or anything like that. So I always pose the question, would you go into someone's flat and say, well, that cable that's going behind your wall, you can't see it because you've got plaster, it's all chased in, but it's coming from flat 5 through your flat and into another one. You own that section of that cable. No, because that would just be absolute, crazy. You wouldn't be able to do that. Well, that's what you're doing with fire.
You are, but if with leaseholders, in most leases, that front door is the leaseholders. It's not you as the building manager. It's not your demise. And this is part of the problem with the new fire safety order, is working out, and to a degree with the building safety bill, is working out how do you actually implement these proposed changes. And then if you get into the Grenfell inquiry recommendations, that really, a lot of those just completely ignore landlord and tenant law. And I've had people calling me saying, look, we're doing a sprinkler installation in buildings, and leaseholders are actually, we're funding, with the landlord, we've offered to fund it, but the leaseholder's just refusing to let us in to extend the sprinkler into their apartment. Wow. So, but then you start to put responsibility onto the new accountable person and building safety manager under the building safety bill.
Yeah.
And they don't actually at the moment have the legal power to enter people's private apartments, so there's all sorts of unintended consequences of this. But yeah, I think at its root, if me being a dick puts you at risk next door, who's responsible for managing those relationships and making sure that I'm not lighting a massive barbecue on my balcony and doing all this, storing kerosene on it or paraffin for the boiler, whatever it is. There has to be, I think, the legal power for a building manager to be able to manage the safety of that building effectively. And it's being worked on, but it's not a simple transition.
See, I'm probably controversial, and obviously I'm wrong, because we wouldn't be changing legislation if I was right, but I thought it was there, Matt, if I'm honest. I thought, it didn't say it line for line, but I thought the regulatory reform order did quite a good job. And I've been in, I very clearly remember sitting in a pub, ordered dinner, me, another, what I would class as the most experienced fire safety professional I've ever come across in my entire career. This guy had fire engineer, fire risk assessor coming out of his ears. Me and him and 2 fire officers worked for a fire service, and all of us could not agree on who owned the fire door. Not one of us. It was just, and as the drinks kept coming, it was like I don't know, you know what these business meets are like pre-COVID. It's, we had more and more beers, and it just got more and more heated, and we just couldn't agree. And we agreed on the fact that they're a vital component, but it's who pays for it, and that's what this comes down to. And when I look at it, I just think, if I'm a landlord and one of my tenants puts another tenant at risk, the only connecting thing between them is me. therefore it has to be my responsibility. Within reason, you have a responsibility yourself, obviously, but it has to be my responsibility to some entity. But that fire door, I don't see how that can be anyone's other responsibility other than the landlord, as far as I'm concerned. And I understand that, you know, landlords in these who own these huge blocks of buildings, sometimes it's a political nightmare, and like you just said, it's a legal nightmare as well. Sometimes you've got the Housing Act might conflict with the regulatory reform order, or it might conflict with something else, and you can't do this and you can't do that, and it's a nightmare. I remember the challenges I had just to service someone's boiler. Like, we're doing a job for you, come and service your boiler in a rented stock. It was just a nightmare, and the amount of wasted money.
One of the problems with the regulatory reform order is that, you know, it's born out of workplaces. So if you look at something,
that's a fair point,
as simple as sharing of the fire risk assessment. So as an employee, I have a right to see the fire risk assessment for my workplace from my employer. That's enshrined in law. As a resident within a residential building, I don't have that right. So there's an inconsistency there that still hasn't been addressed. So obviously, that will be enshrined in law for under the building safety regulator, under the building safety bill, but only for buildings over 18 metres or over 6 stories. So that's 13,000 buildings out of probably 2 or 3, 400,000 that would be under multi-occupancy residential under the order. So there's so much further to go that, you know, and I said this to somebody the other day, that if you look out of your window of your flat and you see a car in the car park that you don't recognise, you can go online, and with a couple of apps, you can look up whether it's insured, whether it's MOT'd, you know, what it is. You know, you can see all that information about a car, but you don't know whether the building you live in is safe or not, and you have no way of knowing. You have no legal power. You cannot compel. I mean, so we end up talking to people about saying, well, my landlord won't give me my fire risk assessment. I really want to see it, and I'm worried. What can I do? Well, get the local fire and rescue service to come and do a visit. They can compel a copy of the FRA and then submit a freedom of information request to the fire and rescue service and you just end up with these bizarre constructs that are just completely bloody stupid. No, this is a risk assessment for the building that should be suitable and sufficient. You have to do it by law. I know that residents aren't your employees, but you owe them an even greater duty of care. You know, if I come into the office for 3 hours a week, okay, I'm at some risk, but there's fire alarms, there's simultaneous evacuation, it's not a sleeping risk, it's not my home, I'm not cooking in it.
Yep.
It's fairly benign, but I've got more of a right to see that information at work than I have in my home.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
Just seems bonkers, and that's just one of the many stupid things that goes on, and why I think we've got ourselves in such a pickle when it comes to the likes of Grenfell. And all the shenanigans that are going on coming out in the inquiry now, and how we've got such a mess because we just don't do the basics right. I think the other point that I would say you mentioned about it is, I think we could do a lot more with the legislation we've already got. You know, but I don't necessarily agree with the fact that we've got to rip everything up and start again. It sort of came from Hackett, that everything was broken. Nobody knows what they're doing. They're all useless. Let's start again, you know, and start comparing apartment blocks to oil rigs or chemical plants. They're not. These are simple things. They're blocks of flats. They don't all spontaneously combust. They're not hugely dangerous, generally. We just need to be better at managing what we've got. And we need to tweak a bit of the legislation. I don't think we need this whole kind of years and years of dragging 2 bills through Parliament, personally. But, you know, they're on their way through.
I think to some point, I would like to see. I would like to see what the building safety case kind of stuff brings, and I'd like to see if it helps. But I'm kind of skeptical about it, if I'm honest, because I think, like you alluded to there, we had the systems in place. You know, if you do a good fire risk assessment, that is a building safety case, obviously just focusing on fire, but it's the same thing, really. And I just think, you know, the systems this I mean, this is just so complicated sometimes when you get into it, but I think that the systems were not really the root cause of an issue, but in some cases they will, and I'll come back. They were, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But like, what this came down to, I think, is just people just weren't looking after the buildings. Like, a lot of people just had buildings and they just weren't looking after it, and that you've got another problem in the fact that the level of competency within the fire risk assessing profession just unbelievably varies. You can have one that's got the same qualifications, the same experience as another, and one is horrendous and the other one is outstanding. The other thing is the guidance systems that people are using to risk assess these buildings are really hard to work with, as to work out what building you're doing and what building falls into what guide. Excuse me, that's a nightmare. But then when you look at it, and what I think Dame Judith Hackett did really well was addressing some of the systemic issues that we have in the construction sector, in that some of the newest buildings, both when I worked in healthcare and when I worked in housing, the newer buildings were 9 times out of 10 the worst ones. The lack of education around, basic fire stopping, compartmentation, escape routes, even design issues were just horrendous sometimes. And it's just, you can see the goal conflicts. You can see the goal conflicts of get this stuff up as quick as possible and forget everything else. Pink foam is a great example. It's like an ongoing joke now. If you're in the fire game, of like, everybody thinks that this pink foam that you see in your cupboard on a block of flats is this magical pink foam that stops everything. But everybody who knows about fire safety, or even knows about a basis of compartmentation, knows that it does bugger all, other than when it's in I think it's like a 3 mil hole or something like that, a 5 mil hole if I remember rightly. That's all it's designed for. And I think Dame Judith Hackett addresses that as well. But it's just like, it was there, the information was there. So there's systemic issues within the construction sector, because you're just handing a tray of this pink foam stuff, this expanding foam, and giving it to apprentice Matt and saying, Matt, go and fill every hole that you see with this stuff.
Yep. And
you just like, so you've got poor competency when we're building it, poor competency when we're assessing it, poor competency when we're managing it, a goal conflicts at probably all of those. And I just think, I wonder whether building safety cases, whether residency and risk assessments are really going to make a difference. I just wonder there will just be more paperwork and less actual change. I don't know. Maybe that's just a skeptic in me.
I think it will. I mean, the one of the issues that you've got, because we're moving from this sort of, I'll use the term loosely, sort of rules-based system to a risk-based regulatory system in high-rise, is that effectively the mechanism that the government have proposed is that there's a thing called the building safety charge, which effectively is a demand, 28 days demand to pay for building safety work that can come from, and it bypasses Section 20 of the Landlord and Tenant Act, and effectively it's a different way of charging, sort of outside of the service charge. So effectively, if you, let's take the example that you've got a building manager that says, I'm comfortable with the safety, I'm willing to sign off on it and submit the building safety case. And then you change management, and that new manager has a different risk appetite that maybe would cost 250 grand to satisfy his or her reduced risk appetite. They've got a mechanism to put that to you as a leaseholder, your share, and you pay within 28 days. You have to have the building safety manager and the accountable person nominated. There's a certification regime. And if you as residents don't comply, then you could end up in special measures where the regulator steps in, or ultimately prohibition, everybody out, we're withdrawing your certificate. So that's being enshrined in law. So I think with the best of consequences, it now puts you at a really, really difficult situation. I've sort of described it for leaseholders as a blank check that you're giving to the building manager that you hope they won't write too often, but legally you were in a weak position before, it's now going to be even weaker. Yeah. And that's probably why so many leaseholders have replied to that consultation. Unprecedented. I'm not a great follower of legislation consultations. That's not my bag, but this one I've been deeply involved in. I was quite surprised. I thought it was all going to be trade associations and fire and rescue services and various people like that, but mainly it was punters with really heartbreaking stories of kind of financial ruin as a result of this legislation and interim measures and this kind of zero harm risk aversion culture that's broken out, which is we can't have another Grenfell, which is quite right, but taking very low risk buildings and completely overreacting to the risk. But there's no objective way of risk assessing all of these buildings and comparing them at the moment. It just isn't. There is no matrix to say anyone that scores above a 68 needs work, anybody below 68, that's tolerable. There isn't a consistent metric for comparing these buildings. It's all subjective.
Well, I mean, that for me, that blank check from leaseholders to that's shocking. I think, like you said, it puts them in a weaker position. That to me is just immoral. Like, I just can't believe that. And I know if you were, maybe the housing podcast will completely disagree with me. And you know what? That's the nature of the world nowadays, and that's good. That's a good thing that we disagree with each other, and hopefully we'll get to the right position. But is that not?
I think it's universal. It's universal, really. I think from most quarters, sort of saying it's unfair. Funnily enough, in the consultation, the only people that didn't really mention, because we did sort of keyword analysis looking at words like EWS1 and building safety charge, etc. And there was an interesting trend that the freeholders in their responses rarely mentioned those words, because let's look at it. It's a very friendly piece of legislation to freeholders, effectively. So you could argue that it wasn't necessarily a completely kind of fair response and equitable response, but similarly, a lot of the residents are saying, well, this should just be completely the cost of the freeholder. It's nothing to do with us, where most of the freeholders are fairly absent kind of ground rent owners. They're only exposed to a tiny percent of the value of the building. So then you look at it and say, well, if there's a £10 million bill, is it fair that they foot all of that bill? And then you start getting into, why have we got the bill in the first place? Is it construction defect? Is it retrospective guidance from the government post Grenfell? A lot of it is. And then it's a question of saying, how do we carve up that £10 million bill? Is it the taxpayer that pays it, leaseholders, freeholder, combination of all three, insurers, original construction firm, designers? But just imagine unpicking that kind of issue in a particular building and then multiplying that by hundreds, if not thousands.
It would be a nightmare.
Yeah,
it would. And it's easy for us. It's easy for me to sit here and say, do you know what? You can't charge a leaseholder for that fire door because you haven't maintained it. Over the years, that's just immoral. But then, they'll come back and say, well, I didn't think I owned that door, and therefore I didn't check it. But then I don't know. Maybe it's because maybe I'm biased because of my position and experience. But if I was advising a freeholder, I would just say, do you know what? Like, do you trust? I'm going to give you how much training do you give an employee to do a job, like, and how much do you critically kind of look at their competence all the time, don't you? Yeah. Why do you do that when they're checking the fire door in your office building? Why do you do that? Oh, so that I'm confident that my building is safe, that they're doing a good job, right? But yet you own a block of flats where people sleep, live, eat, drink, and so on and so forth. Drink alcohol, God knows, do whatever. And you're just trusting someone you don't know to do that. When I try to look at it from a brand point of view, as always, my unsuccessful way of coming at it was like, the long and short of it, as if this building goes, yeah, from a legal point of view, it's grey. But do you want your brands on BBC News? Because that's what's going to happen. You're going to have Charlie Slates going, Matt Hodges-Long freeholders have failed to maintain the building over the last 10 years, and it's burnt down and killed X number of people. that's what's going to happen. Look at all the bad press that's come out of like Rydens, who did the work on Grenfell, the local council that owned that building, and so on and so forth. And none of that is good for your brand. But yeah, I suppose, like you say, it always comes down to that legal thing. But do you know what? There's an interesting point I'd like to touch on, and I'd wonder what your opinion is. But the 18-meter line for me just seems stupid and short-sighted, in my opinion. We're going over, like you said, to this risk-based system, yet we're going to this 18-meter rule, which is the opposite of risk-based. If you maintain well a block of flats, to be honest, some of the care and support properties that I've known that are 2-3 stories, that would not fall into all of the new requirements because they're below 18 meters, are 10 times, 30 times, 100 times more dangerous and more at risk than most of the leasehold, freehold, etc., rented stock blocks of flats that I've come across. Those HMOs that you get, that you just go there and you just think, this is the HMO for a very specific customer, for example, the vulnerable customer in most of the cases, extremely vulnerable. And you just think, and then you find out that the house next door, they're knocking through that house and they're knocking through that house, and that you end up having a terrace street of houses that are all just one massive building. And you're just like, this doesn't fall into these new changes from a fire safety point of view, because instead of going up, they've just gone width-wide, but it's just as dangerous. I've had some buildings like rabbit.
So I had a spat would be a wrong word, but a Twitter conversation with Lord Greenhouse, the Minister of State for Building Safety, a few days ago, where he said something, and I called him out and said, look, I think you're looking in the wrong place. This isn't where the risk is. What data do you have for this? And so, the expert evidence of the fire chiefs to the building safety bill consultation, where they keep talking about scope. And then I sort of followed it up, I think the day later, with sort of saying, if Grenfell had been a care home, we'd all be obsessed by care homes now.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, the risk is still in the care homes. If you just look at the London Fire Brigade enforcement record, the risk is in the shop with the 2-story maisonette above it, with poor maintenance, like Ealing the other day, which killed a couple of people. It's not in the high-rise sort of Grenfell type of building. The risk is still there, but the fire brigades are not out visiting that type of building all the time. There's other buildings that they visit because they know where the deaths are, they know where the risks are. But yeah, we're focused on this 18 meters. I think Dame Judith originally was at 30 meters. That was brought to 18. There's talk of going to 11. Yeah. But still, if you're in the 2-story or 3-story timber frame extra care home, you're still below the radar. You've got compartmentation failings all over the place, poor maintenance, and hugely vulnerable residents. If you look at hospitals with shelter in place or phased evacuation, all those sorts of things, you mentioned it earlier, but a good friend of mine, Steve McKenzie, has just published an open letter to the government calling for a public inquiry about fire safety in PFI hospitals or in modern hospitals. There's loads of outstanding enforcements in that marketplace. And you've got people there on heart bypass. If there's a fire in that external wall or anywhere, you've got to wait your turn, and you can't just all run. So when you're looking at a 20-meter building full of young professionals in the centre of Manchester with an alarm system, and they've all got 2 arms, 2 legs, fit and healthy, that's a different risk to a slightly lower building full of senior citizens with hearing impairments.
Exactly.
And we've just got this blanket kind of response, which is, well, we've got to start somewhere. We'll look at the scope in the future. Well,
short-sighted.
Not good enough.
You'll end up having you've just literally just you've just hit the nail on the head. For all of those examples, I can corroborate from experience. I've seen it. I've not seen the fires, but I've seen it. New PFI hospitals where you go in and they're supposed to be designed to progressive horizontal evacuation, and you're just like, for those that don't know, it's basically where you work your way across the building and then you finally go out, and you just look at it and you go, there's no way we could sustain a progressive horizontal evacuation in here. And you just think, this is more dangerous than a poorly maintained block of flats.
And then you take that risk and you stick a lovely HPL laminate on the outer skin, and away you go, or ACM, whatever coating it's got, because you could legally do it. It wasn't in breach of the guidance, as I understand it. So you've then got to look at where is the real now. Just because we haven't had one of those, that's luck. Okay, and long may that continue, that we continue this run of luck, if you like. And I don't want to, but I think we do need a more mature conversation about risk and about building safety, and there needs to be a really quick way to actually gather this data. So again, 3 years post Grenfell, the Ministry of Housing is still running around trying to find out what type of buildings we've got and how tall are they and what type of materials we used. This is over 3 years in a crisis situation. I mean, where's the urgency?
Yeah, there isn't.
Just daft.
And then you've got like new models of care being pushed by the NHS, which is a huge demand on the housing sector, and some of the new models and care properties that are being built are nothing short of a care home. And they're huge, vast buildings, but they're like 2-3 stories. They're massive buildings, and some of them are storing, 3 levels of kind of require vulnerabilities, like high needs, mid needs, low needs. And these high needs people, you answer the simple question: can these people self-evacuate? No. Then they need to be in a care home, or they need 24-hour care. And there just does not seem to be an understanding of that throughout the whole housing sector. We just seem to have this complete disconnect between the NHS and the care sector and the housing sector, in which everybody seems it acceptable to put somebody who physically cannot move without assistance into a property on their own. And I understand there's a balance there between quality of life, and I'm not insensitive to that. I understand that, and there's people that mate, I've been told I've been discriminating when I've been saying this person is at serious risk. They cannot evacuate this building. No, you're discriminating. And I'm like, sorry. Like, I could not believe it when I was told that. And I'm just sitting there like, I'm just, my job is to keep people alive. Like, that's what I'm here to do. And it's upsetting that you're turning around to me and saying I'm discriminating. If anything, it's the opposite. I'm saying that you're discriminating because you're putting that person in there and you're putting them at risk because of their disability or because of their vulnerability. And you've got these goal conflicts of the massive pressure that the NHS are under, and the housing sector, I think, have just got pound signs. And I'm just speaking hypothetically here, but I genuinely think they're just seeing pound signs and they're going, we can do that. We'll have all your people, put them in this new block we've made. That's a new models of care building. And oh shit, now we've got loads of people that are there 24/7 that should be having 24/7 care. They've got nothing. It's the middle of the night, a fire happens, you got one security guard, and the fire service turn up and they go, you've got to evacuate. And they say, we can't. Why? Because you've got 26 people here who are high needs. They're bedridden. What's it going to take? We're going to kill another 70-something people? It's just scary. It's scary.
Yeah, it does bog. I mean, there'll always be the sort of the economic incentive or disincentive, won't there? But if you look at that type of building and say, for a fairly modest amount of money, you could have sprinkled that building, for example. Give everybody some more time, or maybe even, extinguish the fire or certainly suppress it. But we've decided to save the 60 grand or whatever the amount is. That, I think, is where it becomes intolerable. And then you say, well, okay, let's build that out of timber frame. Let's not maintain the timber frame properly or do any intrusive inspections into it. And you start layering on, you could just see what that inquiry would look like. And personally, if I was an asset director of a housing association or whatever it was, do you know what? I wouldn't want that on my conscience. I would be making, and actually I have heard from a number of them that despite what's going on with high-rise buildings, their focus is not on high-rise buildings at the moment, it's on the low-rise stuff, because they know where the risk is. So if I've got fire officers telling me the risk isn't where the government think it is, and I've got housing professionals telling me the risk is not where the government thinks it is, I'm going to listen to them over some politics graduate that's working in the Ministry of Housing now, that's being fed whatever they're being fed by industry associations or whatever. I'll go to the people that turn up to fires, and I'll listen to them, thank you very much. And if they're saying this is where our concern is, but that's nowhere near Dame Judith Hackett's scope at the moment, it doesn't mean to say that that risk's gone away. It needs to be managed. So we need to have this conversation, and people need to be aware of it. And on the flip side, I think I know there's thousands of people living in flats at the moment that genuinely believe every night they go to bed they're going to die in a hideous fire. Wow. That's the level of panic, if you like. We've got people that are buying, going on Amazon and buying ladders that they can throw over their balcony. They're buying fire extinguishers. They're petrified for what is actually, we're looking for it and saying, well, where's the real risk here? We can't see it, certainly not in relation, but they're being told, you've got a flat that's worthless, it needs millions of pounds worth of work doing to it because it could be the next Grenfell. Nobody can buy or sell. We need to put people here in high-vis jackets wandering around sniffing for smoke with a squirty air gun horn. Most of the time they're watching Netflix, playing on their mobile phones and chatting outside. That's the objective evidence that comes, as you can imagine, the sort of the human fire alarm waking watchman or woman. And that's the reality of where we are today. It's one of those things that if you talk to somebody new about this and you start explaining it, they look at you and say, well, this can't possibly, you're making something up. And the more you dig, the worse it gets, or the more the contagion spreads. And there really does need to be some kind of appliance of common sense here, really. And to get the market stabilized again and actually prioritize the government, for example. Have you heard of the Building Safety Fund that the government put up? So it's a cladding remediation fund or lottery, but they're applying the money, which is insufficient anyway, on a first come first served basis. So you could be number 25 in the queue and you get to number 25 or number 250 and the money's run out, but actually you could be the highest risk building in the country, but there's no cash because it's a first come first served application rather than putting. So my view always was, we need to score all of these buildings on risk, and then we need to say, right, okay, where is the risk appetite and who's got the highest number, right? And then start working your way down the list to below where the risk appetite is. But we could well be remediating loads of buildings at taxpayers' expense that either didn't need it or didn't need it as badly as the ones that then don't get funded. So is this fund about building safety, or what is it for? And unfortunately, nobody seems to be able to answer that question. It's one of the many outstanding questions.
That kind of fear that you're talking about with the residents is that all centered around the cladding? Is it all centered around their perception of, or I have the the flammable cladding on my building, I'm going to die imminently, or
it's born out of cladding, and the conversation is moving towards one of building safety.
Okay.
So you might lose the building potentially from the cladding, but you've got an amazing alarm system. You've got multiple routes for escape. You're all fit and healthy. Internal compartmentation's good, etc., versus you've got cladding issues, but actually your even bigger issue is wholesale sort of compartmentation failure within the building. Smoke log staircases and all sorts of stuff, which a lot of people don't know they've got yet, because the intrusive survey work is being done in the external wall, but not in the internal makeup of the building. So we always say to people, unless you've got that thorough understanding of the external wall and you've got a type 4 FRA or investigative work to actually show that the compartmentation is going to work, you need both sides of the equation. So the fire safety bill that's going through at the moment, which will amend the fire safety order or revise the fire safety order, is actually saying that the fire risk assessment needs to include the external wall. So that change is coming, and that, as we understand it, is 1.7 million buildings will require an assessment of their external wall. Mm. Now, the question I haven't had an answer to yet is, at the point where the fire engineering community or the fire risk assessment community understood that in Grenfell the external wall was a major part of the failure of the building, without changing the fire safety order, how were fire risk assessments conducted beyond that point suitable and sufficient if they didn't include even a nod to the external wall?
Exactly. It's a foreseeable risk, therefore it...
Now, nobody, so you've actually got fire associations recommending to members to specifically exclude the external wall from their fire risk assessments. Well, how is that, as a responsible person, how is that suitable and sufficient? I can understand from a practitioner's perspective how you could turn around and say, well, I'll do this, but I'll exclude that. Still don't know whether that fits with competence, but certainly from a responsible person's perspective, how can I turn around and say that I've got a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment for the building if I've completely ignored a potential huge accelerant as a part of that building makeup, just because we've always done it the other way? Doesn't make it, you know, and I don't think that's been tested yet as to what suitable and sufficient means in that context.
There's always been arguments around scope of fire risk assessment that existed before cladding, because before cladding it was communal areas. I'm only here to risk assess the communal areas. Well, in that case, you should only be in there for about 2 seconds, because all you're risk assessing is stairs, and that's it. So, or if you're in a hospital and that hospital is owned by one entity, and within that entity they rent that out to loads of different individual trusts, for example, and you then would have about 50 or 60 different fire risk assessments depending on how many different kind of tenants you have within that building. And if you're the overarching landlord or the facilities management provider or whatever, you do a risk assessment of just that staircase and or just that corridor. And it was always my argument to say, well, this is bloody stupid, because there's just no risk in this. Like, I'm risk assessing it, but the risk is in what my tenants are doing. So it needs to include that. Otherwise, it's not suitable and sufficient. It's just a bullshit waste of my time, and that's not what I'm here to do. So we can argue about scope until the cows come home, and I don't know. From my opinion, I just think it's just common sense, but if you follow it down the letter of the law, then okay, maybe you could argue that it's out of scope. But then you've got the flip side, is what's the quality that you're getting through? I remember post Grenfell, every fire risk assessment I got off a consultant would just say, you must provide evidence that your cladding is not this. And I'm like, well, great, thanks for that. I've just paid you £700 for that risk assessment, and you've given me what? Diddly squat, a shitload of questions. And then we come back to the competency of fire risk assessors thing. So it's all well and good saying, all right, we'll include it in their scope, but it's like, do they have the capacity, the intelligence, the competency to actually give the landlord, who's in theory the uneducated one, I say that in quotations, but to give them what they need? Or are you just going to provide them a shitload of other vague and crappy statements like, you must confirm? I've had a fire risk assessment, Matt, right? And I was at loggerheads with somebody in a meeting room over this, but I've had a fire risk assessment off a so-called competent fire risk assessor saying, you must confirm this fire door is a fire door. Now, if I'm paying you £700 for a fire risk assessment and you're a fire risk assessor, you should tell me whether that's a fire door or not. And it's just this absolute mess where they would just say, well, I'm a fire risk assessor, I'm not a fire door engineer. And I'm just like, Jesus Christ, what is, like, Grenfell happened, And we went in my opinion, a lot of us went the opposite way. We didn't say, right, let's embrace this, let's just try and get better, let's improve, let's learn. We took it to, we entered fear mode. We tried to start protecting ourselves. We narrowed down our scopes and just say, look, this is all I'm talking about. And we ended up just writing down risk assessments are just full of statements of arse covering. That's all it is. It's a mess. It's an absolute mess.
Yeah, we do lose sight of well, I mean, we spend a lot of time trying to calm people down when they're talking to us and sort of saying, look, let's understand the problem. What are you being told? You know, yes, you've got a fire risk assessment back and there's some stickers missing or something like that. You know, the key thing I want to know is this risk assessment actually for your building, or is it being made up? Who did it? Are the priority actions being followed through? You know, let's look at the really important stuff. Let's focus on that. Yeah, it could always be better, but the reality is you'll probably be fine. There's far more risk in other things you probably do in your daily life. But there is this fear that's come through that is completely understandable as a result of Grenfell. But yeah, to answer your previous point, the obsession is still about the cladding. Politicians still talk about cladding all the time. They don't talk about compartmentation failures and other more technical things. They're just talking about cladding. But yeah, the external walls will need to be surveyed. There is a huge shortage of people with the right level of competence to be able to do that. There are a lot of sharks that have come into the market that really shouldn't be there, but are being given the opportunity to flourish because of the really unbelievably poorly worded process from the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, that they do everything they can to distance themselves from, but it's just, you can drive a bus through the wording. Really? We did a review of it, and the guidance notes, or the rules on the back page of the CWS1 form, there are, I think it was 17 coulds, mays and shoulds, and there's one must. So yeah, you could do it. Well, there's nothing to say if I haven't, so therefore I'll do the opposite. So, and then they get upset when the media are talking about fraud and they're showing them examples of it, and they're running around trying to sort of shut the door when the horse has bolted, you know. And the annoying thing is, we warned them about that in March. So the process was launched in late December. We cottoned onto it by early March, validated it and warned them in the middle of March. And then the story about fraud broke in October. And it had taken from March to October to go through all of the warning everybody and trying to get them to do the right thing, getting exasperated, working with the media, spending 6 weeks putting a story together to then break the story, to get them to do something about it. And you think, if all of that combined effort had been put into making buildings safe, we'd be so much further forward. Yeah. So this is just every aspect of what we're talking about is months, if not half years, if not years of cajoling and mollycoddling and outing people in the media to try and get some positive progress. And it's really not helpful. So 3 years post Grenfell, very few buildings are any safer than they were before Grenfell. Yeah. But we're talking about lovely shiny legislation that's going to take 7 years to roll out for a tiny scope of buildings. And then we wonder, just thankful at the moment we haven't had another Grenfell in this country, but I don't see that the government have done anything to stop that from happening.
We could talk about this all day, and we're not going to, because it's 7 o'clock and I need some dinner, and I'm sure you probably do as well. But I just think it's when you've got, we seem to, in my opinion, we've lost our sense of why we were doing this. That's what it feels like to me. Is you know, it's gone from that sense of that fire that I will never forget watching on the telly. You know, I'll never forget literally having tears roll down my face watching documentaries that came out a year, months later, whatever, where listening to these testimonials of people that are doing, and I think fair play to the residents and the people that are helping the residents, celebrities, whatever, and all the kind of projects that are around it, and trying to keep the momentum there. But I think we lost sight of what we were trying to achieve here quite early on, in which it just became this massive ass covering process. It became knee-jerk reactions of, reacting to cladding and putting everyone in hotels, and, banks not giving people mortgages because the cladding's there, which creates more of a complication for landlords. And it's just this absolute social political mess. And then at the root cause of all this was still, what was it, 72, 74, can't remember now, but
72 lives. Yeah.
72 families have lost somebody. And it's just like, that's why we were doing this.
Yeah, we need to, change does need to happen, but what we've always talked about is that the problem was potentially so big. We need to confront it, and we need to gather that information. We need to really hit it hard to make changes quickly. And at least if that was quantifying the risk and saying, where do we need interim measures? Where do we need remediation activity, et cetera, et cetera? What we've done is this slow drip feeding of buildings in scope, as you talked about earlier, that is missing the target. I used it in a tweet that sort of, we're focused on the ankles rather than the ball, or one of the other, some kind of football analogy. That's the one that's up to the government. Where we're just not looking in the right place. We've allowed ourselves to be deviated from where we should be looking. And now whether that's some kind of bluff or con, or whether that's just a genuine mistake, I don't know. But we just very simply called in November 2018, call in all the fire risk assessments and risk assess based on that, and go back for further information and start risk ranking all of these buildings. With a fire risk assessment, a Google Earth image, and a few people that know what they're doing, and a bit of AI, we can start understanding where the risk is in these buildings. We can start engaging with residents, and we can start dealing with the big issues that we need to deal with. But no.
I think I agree with everything you just said. I think the problem you've got is that it's the poor quality of fire assessments within the UK is just absolutely abysmal. And I'm not tarring everyone with the same brush. I think there are a hell of a lot of really competent, really good fire risk assessors out there, but the dross in that profession overpowers the good, in my opinion. And the majority of fire assessments I saw, and we're just not up to scratch. We're just not up to scratch.
It's a starting point. So at the moment, if that risk assessment is sitting there on a SharePoint drive somewhere, and you know that no one's ever going to look at it unless there's a problem, it's out of sight, out of mind. But if you had to say, well, we've got 50 fire risk assessments and we need to lodge these formally with the Fire and Rescue Service, or with the regulator, or with whoever, make them available to our residents, then you know full well that if the pictures are of a different building, or it's 12 years old, or it's a work of fiction, somebody's going to call you out for that. Whereas they're not going to do it. A resident's not going to step inside your SharePoint drive and find it and tell you there's a problem. So just by giving it that level of transparency, I would say that most people would probably give them a cursory glance and maybe update a few before sharing them. So by bringing that level of ownership in, I think a lot of people, you can get people that don't do the right thing, and people that are fraudsters or charlatans, or call them what you like. But I think most people want to do the right thing, and it's about that gets measured, gets done. Or I don't know, I've forgotten the term, but you know what I mean. You wouldn't overtly want to make a complete knob of yourself by sending somebody a fire risk assessment for their building that wasn't for their building. Okay,
you're
work.
Yeah, you're kind of creating vulnerability, aren't you, in the landlords or the freeholders, or whoever it is, building safety manager, whatever. It creates a sense of vulnerability, because all these people are now can view and critique and ask questions of your fire assessment. Therefore, that should inevitably mean that vulnerability that I feel, say, as a freeholder, means that I would demand a better quality in theory. So I see where you're going with that. Yeah,
But I think the term for that is chronic unease, which is good. But the keep you on the chase. But ultimately, there's a, you are an RP. You are the responsible person. Be flipping responsible.
Exactly.
Okay. And that means a fire risk assessment that's suitable and sufficient is reasonably close to the truth. It isn't one that predated a overcladding project or whatever it was, and one that you're happy to be your best work. You're happy to. Why would you want to hide that from a resident? Now, the only way they're going to beat you use it as a stick to beat you with is if you've got a whole bunch of red remediation activities in there that you haven't bothered to do for 3 years. That's the point, and that's the responsibility, that's the accountability. And if you know that, we've got ways of reading them with machine learning and actually risk assessing. You don't even have to have a human being that's reading the fire risk assessments if you train it. And one of the bits of feedback we've had from some of the fire and rescue services is, I really like the idea, but if we suddenly had 10,000 fire risk assessments on our systems and we were to miss one and there was a problem, then somebody could come back to us and say, well, why didn't you spot it?
Yeah.
So there's all these sorts of cultural blame issues or lack of safety. And actually, I think the publishing of these things is probably more placebo in a sense. But if you've got a machine that can read them all and can say, do you know what? There's 5 buildings in this data set and they've all got the same images. Or the postcodes don't check out, or the fire risk assessor did 50 fire risk assessments on the same day.
Yeah.
Those sorts of things. He or she is just selling their signature. All this stuff going on to legitimize things. It's happening in EWS1, by the way, that people are just procuring signatures from supposed professionals.
Christ.
So it's very easy to spot this fraud, but not with the naked eye. It needs to be done with machine. And that's part of what we're pushing, is sort of saying you need that surveillance in place and you need to be able to spot weird behavior, because that's the biggest precursor to a fraud or to a potential issue. So let's make it digital. Let's do it. Let's do the basics. Let's do it at scale, and make buildings safer.
Well, a great way to end it. That was a lovely little statement there, Matt.
Right.
Very well done.
Will be good. I'm goosed, so I need some dinner. I made it before we recorded. It's all prepared. It just needs to go in the oven. So.
Oh, okay. Well, I won't hold you back much longer, Matt. If people want to get involved with yourselves, either of the kind of stuff that you're doing, I know you're spinning a couple of plates now. How would they go about that?
So with me on LinkedIn, so Matt Hodges-Long on LinkedIn. So that's Hodges-Long. Twitter at BLDG Safety Reg, Building Safety Register, or me at Matt Hodges-Long. Email, don't bother with that anymore because I probably won't answer it. So best thing is LinkedIn or Twitter DM. You find me somewhere, find me on Google, and have a chat, and sort of always happy to talk to anybody that wants to talk compliance, governance, risk, software, building safety, just anything.
Look at that, my light's just gone. Look at that for timing. Gone to the bog standard stuff now, mate. Onto just a standard hanging.
Need to put another 50p in the meter.
Yeah,
so in any way, just reach out, and if someone can't find me, then ping you a note, James, and I'm sure you'll find my email address somewhere and get hold of me. But no, it's been great to talk.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you very much, Matt. Now I'm sitting in the dark. We might as well just nip it in the bud. But I think
no worries.
I think there's another conversation there about I forgot it.
EWS1.
EWS1. I think that's a very. We'll get a day in the diary, I think, to have a chat about
that.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll make it a date. We'll see you soon.
For sure. Thanks a lot, Matt.
Okay, peeps, hope you enjoyed that. Don't forget to listen in a couple of days for our reflection episode. You'll have noticed that reflection episodes are coming like randomly within the middle of the week. Well, that's because we've had to tweak the way we've done our structure and bring another interview into the month schedule because, well, frankly, we just had so many interviews that we were not going to be putting people out for like nearly 2 years, which we didn't want to do. So we're bringing another interview in to the weekly schedule, which meant that we put the reflection episode out on the same week. So hopefully you're enjoying that. Basically, you're getting 2 extra podcast episodes a month, which is just a win for you. Hope you enjoyed this chat with Matt. Don't forget to go check out his company. All the links in the description, right? Check out his LinkedIn as well. This guy's really active on LinkedIn and Twitter, so check them out. I'll put all the socials in the description below. Don't forget to check out Project Mollitiam, or DM me on LinkedIn, or come and send me an email at James@Rebranding Safety if you want to try this out for free. I promise you, you will not regret it. Everyone that's joined is absolutely loving it. Trust me, it's good. And don't forget to go check out Paradigm if you're looking for some support with health and safety compliance, and you want that support to be absolute nailed on, and you want it to be with that kind of better way of thinking about safety woven in through it. That is the place for you. So go check them out. Or if you're not sure, check them out on their website as well, and you can go to their webinar every week. So thanks for listening. I'll catch you in a few days in the reflection episode. Safe.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the host and its guests and do not necessarily reflect the position of the companies. Examples of analysis discussed within this podcast are examples only based on limited and dated open source information and should not be utilised in real life as the only solution available. Assumptions made within this analysis are not reflective of the position of the companies. No part of this podcast may be reproduced, stored or transmitted in any form or by any means, mechanical, electronic or otherwise, without prior written permission from James MacPherson.